All right, so welcome back, Dr. Schaefer, and you're our first person that we're asking to do this year's MS Clinician Series.
Oh, great.
And last year we did it based on disease-modifying therapies, and this year we're going to be doing on various symptoms and symptom management. And so I wanted to ask you questions first concerning all of this. And so, what I'd really like to know, though, is how your patients come to you. Do they just offer, or do you have to pull out of them what's really going on with them in their lives, and how are the symptoms affecting them?
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's always good to see you. I haven't seen you for a whole, 3 or 4 months. Last time we talked. It's good to see you. Well, yeah, I think that first off, the patients need to be able to know they can be engaged with their physician. That's just important, because patients are going to open up to you if they know they can, right? I mean, so that's very important. On a regular basis, patients may not always know that their symptoms are something that matters or is really concerning to them. They live with it every day. So we generally go through this whole regimented list of things with our patients, and we get in, and say, hi, how you doing? And we ask them generally how things are going and how's life going. They're like, oh, we're doing good and things are just fine. But when you start drilling down on things, the wife or the husband may be going, well, you're not doing that anymore, or, and so you first want to engage them in how things are going. My notes usually reflect last time's visit. We'll say, and I'm more about they took a trip to the Caribbean and they did hiking and this is going on. So I can go back and go, hey, so you done any more trips? No, I haven't done any trips. Why can't I do any trips? Well, we're kind of not doing as much as we were doing. Okay, what's that from? Well, I've been feeling tired, or I'm not doing as much. So it kind of gets you going a little bit there. Maybe they were saying things are good, but commonly, symptoms may be. We ask them, on a day-to-day basis, what are you doing to keep yourself active? Okay. Well, I get out and I walk for 10 minutes. That's good. Now, what were you doing 6 months ago or a year ago? Well, you were walking a mile, two miles a year ago. And these are things that maybe creep up on patients that didn't realize. So there's these chronic, progressive kind of symptoms that change, and lifestyle and function that we look at. Again, fatigue and walking abilities, walking tolerance, balance, cognition's a big one. Are we keeping up with the household tasks around the house? Are we managing the finances, or were we doing it now? We're not doing it now. Are we people have kids at home? Are keeping up with the kids? Bladder issues. We ask about bladder issues. There's these key components. We start at the top and go down: cognition, vision, swallowing, general functional health. Bladder, bowel, sexual function. I've most of my patients being kid around about that. So how's it going with the house?
Right.
We're still kicking it around the house, and they're like, oh yeah, or they'll say no. So we kind of get into that a little bit, and my PA is very good about that. They like talking to her more than they do me, but still,
I'm sure it's easier to speak to a woman.
Yeah,
than
they get into that more. So yeah, that on a chronic basis, that's things we ask the patients. Try to get an idea about their general function, and then there's more acute changes, as we mentioned earlier, that can occur too.
Speaking about lifestyle changes, how do you like my hat?
I'm digging the hat, man. It's very nice. I like the hat on.
I'm wondering how it looks in this video here.
Actually, I walked in, you had the glasses on, and I didn't recognize it first, but then I said, oh,
well, somebody else, one of your farm reps, walked right by me, and Judy, and she had no idea it was me, and it was pretty good. And we're going to keep all this going here. So, one of the things that I saw even tonight during our program was that a patient wanted to take out her Ampera, and her husband told her to put it away. And I was like listening in because I just wanted to hear what was going on. And she said, no, but I need to take it. It's my time to take it. He says, well, I don't see it doing any good for you. Just put it away. How do you speak with the caregivers and the patients about symptom management, medications, and what might be better for them, even though the caregiver may not see its worth?
Right. No, we see that a lot, that dynamic, because as you know, MS it's a patient that has MS, but it's a family that has MS. So
right.
it's the spouse, the caregiver, the kids. And we see, I see a lot of times I see the 13 and 14-year-old kid that is actually the parent of the two. That the parents are both dysfunctional because they're not managing with the relationship very well, because one's in denial about it, usually the spouse, and the patient is trying to put up with it, and then the spouse thinks that the patient's being needy because they have MS and it's an excuse, and so the 13-year-old's like, okay, you guys, I'm taking over here. So we see that a lot. So we try to read that in the patients in the room. Many patients will come in and the patient will tell us, well, I'm taking my spasticity medicines, my Empara medicines, my DMTs, and for those caregivers that kind of sometimes roll their eyes, if you will, or they kind of like, we're not sure if it's doing much for, I try to bring up the fact that there's two components to it. One is, in the patient's mind, they're doing something they think is helping them take control of their disease. And in their mind, if it's helping them, even if it is psychologically to some degree, and maybe some component to that, that's helpful. That's okay, as long as they're not causing side effects for the drug. I mean, if someone's having side effects, we're going to have to take them off that medication. The other side of it is, I told the caregiver, I said, listen, you may not see this making change here. What we're looking for is to see if they're going to be better. And they're not necessarily going to get better. We're trying to keep you here. So I say, what if you weren't on therapy? We can't tell you that she wouldn't or he wouldn't be doing a whole lot worse if they're not on that drug. Are we going to take the chance of coming off the medication? Probably not. But unless the patient, of course, has a new symptom, we put them on something, and they don't notice any change themselves, we may make consideration to make a switch. But we try to get the caregiver to understand there's a couple of components to the fact that they're on medication. One is the fact that they feel they're doing something to help themselves, but two, that in the absence of therapy, it's the ideas about not now or today, it's keeping the level of function down the road. And that's what we're trying to maintain.
That's right. So going back to now the people that you brought up a subject a few minutes ago about cognition. And so there's the parent with MS, and they're having severe memory problems where it's to the point, though, that they come to you, they're not recognizing that they have a problem because they can't remember that they have this problem, and yet you might see it. And what do you do for that person that's having these problems?
Yeah, I think that there's two components to that. One is that there's the patient who comes in the absence of any support system, and you notice that they're really having trouble with processing, and they may have drove themselves to the clinic that day, or and they're kind of saying things, and the things aren't computing, so you're kind of like, so who's with you helping things out? And they may or may not have that support system. Those patients who don't have support systems, who we see cognitive dysfunction affected, and we bring it to their attention. We try to, like you said, in many cases, people with true cognitive problems don't realize it. It's the patient that tells me that, oh my gosh, I'm losing my mind, and this, those people I don't worry about because they're aware of it. The person who goes, fine, don't worry about it, and they say, husband's back there going, they're having trouble, right? So the person who doesn't have the support system, we will engage, commonly home nursing, some agencies going to give us some assessments to look at things. The person who has a spouse with them, I generally will, when they come in the room, and I know this person's got cognitive dysfunction, I'll ask the spouse to kind of be the fly on the wall, or be a fly on the wall, and let me speak to the patient. And I go through the patient with a series of questions, and it gives me an understanding of how they think the situation's going. And I get their whole situation, what they think is happening in their day, in their life, and how they're doing things. And then I go to the spouse, and I say, okay, here's all the information I just got. How much of this information is real? And then sometimes they find it hard to say it, but I say, you've got to let me know if this is all on track. Someone say, yeah, she's right on track. All right, then we got somebody who's got some relatively preserved cognition. They're doing okay. They may have multitasking problems, and that's common in MS. Their frontal lobe function is really impacted in MS, and that's that function I tell people, it's called remembering to remember. There's memory, which is a true memory loss, right? So if I tell someone with a memory loss problem like Alzheimer's, go to the store and get some milk, bread, and eggs. They'll go to the store, they'll come back, and you're going to go, where's the stuff? They're going to go, what stuff? You didn't tell me to do a thing. We have this big argument. The person with frontal lobe function or executive function problems, which is common in MS, will tell them, go to the store, get some milk, bread, and eggs. They'll come back, and you go, where's the stuff? They go, oh, I forgot the milk, the bread, and the eggs. Because it's remembering to remember. It's the Rolodex in our frontal lobes that's continuously functioning to keep things in front set, so remember them, right? So the executive function problem. So we'll get to the caregiver and ask them how they're feeling things are going. If they tell they're way off base here, then we know we've got some other cognitive issues. And depending on what's going on, the therapies are on, certainly somebody's on a certain drug, we worry about, PML, and they've got sudden cognitive changes, that's the big red flag. Get MRI, do things like that, those sort of things. But
do you suggest cognitive testing at all?
It's cognitive testing. I think is limited in a number of ways. Number one, we any one person, we don't have baseline. So where were they at one time? And so we're taking a point on a line and going, okay, you're abnormal. Well, you may have been abnormal for a long time. So cognitive testing can be good in serial longitudinal testing. It can be helpful in teasing out depression and some other things maybe you can't tease out sometimes. Patients sometimes, depression probably, I think really in MS patients is probably the most common reason for cognitive dysfunction. It may not be crying and sad and the world's coming to an end. It can be lack of concentration, poor interest in things, no energy. As I mentioned, concentration. Those things can all be part of depression. It's called endogenous depression. And we'll get people on SSI or something. Sometimes it helps out a lot.
So you said that you don't have a baseline, but what about for the newly diagnosed patient? What do you do then? If you have a newly diagnosed patient and you see cognitive issues and this person is still working for a period of time, but now they find that they feel that they're getting worse and they want to look at maybe going into Social Security disability income.
No, we absolutely get, yes. We get formal neuropsych testing done and we get some documentation because it's very hard to get disability on the cognitive side of things. And it's a very real thing. We've gotten it for patients. But a lot of times, if you look at the criteria of disability, it doesn't even list cognition in there.
Right.
So it's hard. But you can get it, and that's very important for that piece of it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you about bladder issues. Not that I have them, but let me ask you about bladder issues. All right. So what are like some of the new devices out there for people with bladder issues?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you know, the bladder issues have several tiers. We've got the neurogenic bladder early on, and many patients are managed well with medications, with exercises and things of that nature. But at some point in time, a subgroup of patients become refractory to medications and require self-catheterization on a regular basis, or even enjoying Foley catheterization. So over the years, Foley catheters have been commonly used. It's a catheter that's inserted through the urethra into the bladder. It has issues over the long term. It's a nuisance. It's in the urethra. It's not very comfortable. It's kind of an area that's commonly bacteria laden, hard to keep clean. It's very, very disruptive to the tissue of the urethra. And honestly, it doesn't allow for any intimacy for patients who maybe want to have a spouse. So it creates issues there too. So that is one side of the difficulty with chronic indwelling Foley catheters. Self-catheterization is really kind of nice for patients who have good hand function, but over time they may begin to lose dexterity. And then you got to find a bathroom, and you have to find a way to get the catheters out, and strip the thing off, and clean up, and insert a catheter. I mean, it's a nuisance when you're going out and do things. It works for a while. Patients don't mind that. But then it becomes an issue where they can't use their hands, and now spouses maybe are self-cathing the patient. Patients who've been doing this for years, and it's like, it's not something that's really, you do it because it's your duty and you want to do it, you love your spouse, but it's difficult no matter who you are. I mean, I don't care what anybody says. And for years, since Civil War, they've been doing suprapubic catheterization, which is the way to penetrate the bladder through the abdomen wall just above the pubic bone where the bladder sits. It's a way to get a bladder catheterized without having to go through the urethra. Over the years, they've been doing it through what's called a trocar punch, which is basically just you fill the bladder with water, you kind of hope the ultrasound, you hope you're in the right spot, and you put a punch, and you basically just punch right through the bladder, right through the abdominal wall. And it's not been used, it's used, but it's fallen out of favor in the last 30, 40 years because complications, morbidity and mortality, infections with it. So now everyone was gone to the urethral catheter. In the last year or two, there has been a device called the T-Spec device, which is used to place indwelling suprapubic catheters through the urethra. And it's 100% in the right area because you're going through the urethra, you're going through, up through the bladder, poking through the abdomen, the outside. It's inside out. It's the first inside-out medical device, actually, that's ever been made. You pop right out, you're outside the bladder, you pull back in, thread through, it takes 5 minutes, it's in. So it's a very, very safe, very, very efficient way to place suprapubic catheters. By doing SPC, patients no longer have to catheterize. They now have the perineum is free of catheters. It's easier to manage. It's cleaner. It's more comfortable. Again, intimacy issues are better this way. And now you don't have to worry about, you can cap this thing, go do your day. If you want, you can drain it when you want to. At nighttime, you cap a small bag and let it sleep all night long. You're not spending thousands of dollars a year on pads in bed, which they have to do now with catheters. Most patients who are catheterized, they just put pads down and say, I'll be incontinent, and they end up urinating in the bed all night. And they get up in the morning, they clean up every day and put new pads on. So it's been a very nice device. There's been a re-emergence. There's an adoption going on right now to bring SBC back to the forefront to manage chronic indwelling catheter issues. But it's coming along, and as you know, we've been pretty on the forefront of bringing this to people.
Good. So I think that's going to be it for today.
Fantastic. Do you want to mention for 2 seconds on relapses at all?
Do you want to mention about relapses?
Well, yeah, I think relapses are important.
Okay, so let's
give
talk.
me 2 minutes on relapses.
Yes, we could do that.
Because I think it's important.
Let me ask you another question, and that is about when I hear a lot from patients that complain that they're having a relapse, and of course I have to tell them to see their doctor.
Right.
But are they really having a relapse? I mean, do they know what a relapse really is about? How do you know that? How do you know, as the clinician, how do you know that they're actually having a relapse?
Right. Well, okay, so a quick overview. The relapse are important because they signify disease breakthrough, and that's, for us, that's a very important factor, because the drug therapies we have out there that we talked about tonight, one of the things to look for is relapse reduction. So it's important for patients to recognize a relapse, as you mentioned. So what does that mean? And many times patients think that something's occurring, they think, I'll blow that off, it's not really a relapse. So what is a relapse? Any new symptom or any old symptom that changes and lasts more than 24 hours, by definition, there's one component to a relapse. 2, if the patient doesn't have any other factor that can be listing these symptoms, okay? Are they infected? Is there some kind of other medication going on that they might be taking that could cause these symptoms? Okay, so anything that lasts more than 24 hours, anything that's new in onset or new change, or an old symptom that's reemerged more than 24 hours. If you don't have any other factors that are affecting it that could be causing it, maybe a relapse. Okay, so anything that comes on, I tell patients, anything. If your bladder suddenly becomes like incontinent for more than 2 days, that's a relapse. And now we'll check it for UTI. You got UTI, well then it's pseudo-relapse, but we'll check it for UTI. If you suddenly become more fatigued and sometimes it's so washed out, no infection, well then you're probably talking relapse. Certainly there's obvious relapse symptoms, which are paralysis and sensory changes and optic neuritis and those sort of things. But as I tell patients, if you think at all that you've got symptoms that aren't normal to what you're normally having, just call your doctor or call us, and we'll decide if it's a relapse. Don't just blow it off. See me a month later. Say, I spent 2 weeks, I couldn't get out of bed. It's a chance to treat a relapse if we can.
In fact, I just heard that tonight. Somebody's been indoors, basically in bed, for over a month, and she thinks she's having a relapse.
I think.
She thinks.
I'm
but there's nothing confirmed.
Yeah.
Did you go see your doctor? No, because I think I'm having a relapse. Are you being treated? No, because I haven't gotten to see the doctor.
Yeah, because I think I'm going to relapse. Good. So, I know. And, God bless the patients. I mean, they really, don't know sometimes, and sometimes they even feel intimidated to talk to the doctors about these things.
Right.
And I think you have to try to create that open door, and I think that's where your PAs help, and MPs, and everybody else in the office is really important for those sort of things.
Right. So what do you do for the patient with relapse? Do you just suggest rest, or do you suggest something medicinal?
Well, the mainstay of therapy is IV steroids. I mean, 3 to 5 days. The patients that are not able to manage or have side effects from steroids, or poor IV access, or have had reactions in the past, or not respond to steroids of recent, we consider the Athgar gel, which is a repository hormone that we use called ACTH.
Good.
Very good therapy.
Good. Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thank you for all your answers. I look forward to coming back and doing this with you again.
I know. I like you coming up and seeing me.